Hello, today we are going to talk about read-alouds, our favorite read-alouds of the year and our least favorite read-alouds of the year. Hi, I am Rachel from 7 in Awe, and this video is part of an annual collaboration with Katie from Life in the Mundane. Katie has a large family. She's a second-generation homeschooler just like me, and she shares a lot of videos about homeschooling with a large family and special needs homeschooling, so definitely check out her channel if you haven't already heard of her videos. But she's gathered a bunch of us here today to share some read-aloud inspiration as we move toward wrapping up the school year. And according to my records, we actually read about 20 chapter book read-alouds this year. My sons this year were in first grade and pre-K, and this was our first real full year reading actual chapter book read-alouds. We have always read a lot of books, but this was the year when I was like, okay, we're gonna jump into making chapter books a part of our routine. And I will just tell you, what worked best for chapter books for us in this year was to do them at bedtime. Chapter books tend to be a little longer than picture books, right? And I have a very active younger son who turned into a toddler mid-year. He turned 1 in December. So doing our chapter books actually at bedtime rather than during the school day is working better for us right now. But yeah, we had about 20 chapter book read-alouds this year. And I'm gonna share some of our top favorites from that list, as well as a couple that were at the bottom of the list. So I'll share my favorites and least favorites, and I really want to hear from you guys. What were your best book read-alouds of the year and your not so good read-alouds of the year? It happens, it happens. Now for my children's first year of reading chapter books, hearing chapter books read aloud, I really had a mix of older classics that I grew up with, but I also wanted to read some new books that were unfamiliar to me so that I actually also got the surprise while reading them. So we have a mix here. But of course, I had to put this classic on the list, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This is a little bit misleading because this is a Spanish copy. I actually read my mom's English copy to them because we're not yet ready to be reading this type of chapter book in Spanish yet. But I have this for the future, for a future reread. And of course, Narnia is a classic for a reason. Excellent, they really got into it. We will be continuing with this series, reading a book or two in this next year as well. Next up, another old book that was a big hit was Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. And I read this, this was part of Sunlight when I was a kid. This is my mom's book. It still has the Sunlight sticker on it. Looks like it was maybe part of second grade. I don't know what level it's part of now, or even if it's still part of Sunlight. But Mrs. Piggle Wiggle is a classic, very funny book. The chapters are not super long. There are some pictures, not a ton of pictures, but some. And the whole story is based on kids that have some behavioral problems, and then Mrs. Piggle Wiggle is called upon, and she always has an interesting and creative outside-the-box solution to whatever their behavioral problem is. Whether it's never wanting to go to bed, never wanting to share, taking way too long to eat, being too dirty, not wanting to take baths, being selfish. So my kids really like this. I feel like kids can just connect to stories about kids not making good choices, and they enjoyed the humor of this as well. So older book, but really worked for my kids. Then this one, I only have this book here because I think my sister borrowed the first one, but we read both The Wild Robot and The Wild Robot Escapes this year, and these were a big hit with both of my sons. We also watched the Wild Robot movie when it came out, so they really made a lot of memories connected to this book. The chapters are very short if you haven't read this yet, so they kind of love the satisfaction of saying, can we read another chapter? And I love the satisfaction of saying, sure, because the next chapter is like that long. And then we read it, and then they want another chapter. So this is one that you might be reading 5, 6, 7, 8 chapters in a single sitting, but a very fun read, The Wild Robot and The Wild Robot Escapes. Then here's another book where I don't actually have the first one because my sisters have it, but we read Hibiscus. this year, and I'd heard this book highly recommended. I actually didn't really know what to expect other than it was a little girl living in Africa with her family. But reading the first Anna Hibiscus book, I was really amazed by the depth that it contained and some of the really deep ideas about family and cultural values and hard decisions and the way people live. Like, it's not a heavy story, but it is a surprisingly deep story for this little book with a lot of pictures and illustrations. So I was really impressed with the Anna Hibiscus books that we have read so far. Highly recommend. Really, I got this book to be a window into a life and a culture that is very different from our own. You know, I'm raising Mexican, Caucasian boys in Asia. We don't have connections to Africa in our own life. But surprisingly, this book ended up being quite a mirror because she's also in a mixed culture family, and she has some different tension between different sides of her family, different cultures, and some of the things that she described about going to market or kids selling fruit by the side of the road, those were actually very familiar scenes to my sons growing up here where they're growing up in Southeast Asia. So it is amazing, but this is also a common thing. When you look through a window and you start to look at people who have very different lives from you, you actually start to see many similarities and you really start to see what you do have in common. Strongly recommend this series. I was very impressed. Next is another classic I remember from my childhood, *Thehund Dresses* by Eleanor Estes. And this also has quite a few illustrations. They're not super detailed. They leave quite a bit to the imagination. But this is a story really of bullying, teasing, and the impact that it can have. A girl who is known to live in poverty claims that she has 100 dresses. And the girls really tease her about this idea because she clearly doesn't have 100 dresses. And then later it is found out that the 100 dresses she's referring to were pictures that she had drawn and pasted up around her house. But her immigrant family of this girl has just a lot of bad experiences in this town and ends up moving away. And we're kind of seeing the story of the girls who teased her and their response and their realization of the impact of their words on this family. So a very little book, deceptively simple, but can really carry some deep ideas and deep conversation opportunities. Next, *Skunk and Badger*. I personally really enjoyed this. I feel like it was a little bit challenging for my boys. Like, I definitely think some of it went over their heads. I actually ended up creating a literature guide for this book, which I will link to in the description below. It's available on my website for just $3.50. This was a fun book for me. It is a decidedly quirky book, so this is not going to be a book for everybody. Skunk and Badger. Badger is a loner and an introvert, and then Skunk moves into his house because the house doesn't belong to Badger anyways. It belongs to his aunt, so his aunt can decide who she's lending out rooms in her house to, even if Badger's not very happy about that. They kind of have to learn to get along. There are a few pictures and illustrations throughout. It's quirky. There's time-traveling chickens in this. Very interesting, a lot of interesting literary elements going on. Not the most straightforward of books, and that's why I made the literature guide. So I think this was maybe a bit too challenging of a book for my boys this year, but they still enjoyed it. I think it's one that we'll revisit when they're a couple years older. And next up, you know, some classics just become classics and then you read them and you're like, why is this a classic? Other classics, you read them and you're like, yep, this 100% deserves to be a classic. And I would put this one in the second category. *Charlotte's Web* by E.B. White is an absolute classic, and I'm not even an animal lover at all. I kind of sometimes think that animals are really overdone in children's books because I just don't necessarily love animals. But this is so good. It truly is well written, engaging. You get really annoyed with Wilbur sometimes. Like, I think people misunderstand that sometimes. Like, you're not supposed to not be annoyed with Wilbur. You're supposed to be annoyed with Wilbur. He's not the hero here. This is not Wilbur's story. I love the ending to this story. It's a really good one, and this is one my boys actually have already asked to reread, and I do have this one scheduled in Curious Kinder, which we're going through right now. So I am planning that as we go through Curious Kinder, we'll just reread this one again since they already want to hear it again. Next, I'm going to end with a couple of our least favorite books of the year, ones that just weren't hits. We did finish them. This is about a mouse who is also a composer, and his name is Wolfgang Amadeus Mouse. I just don't really feel that the suspension of disbelief really completely worked in this book, is what I would say. You definitely need some suspension of disbelief for this story to work, and for me, it didn't. This might work better for like a kid reader type book. Like, it has the small print, but it does have short chapters and pictures, and you know, maybe if just a kid is reading it, the suspension of disbelief might work better. But as I read aloud and reading it as an adult, I'm kind of like, what? I don't know, it didn't hit for me. Then The Adventures of the South Pole Pig. I was excited about this one. I mean, the cover looks fun. The name, The Adventures of the South Pole Pig. This looks really adventurous and cute and funny. For me, it was surprisingly slow moving. For a book that is titled Adventures, you kind of feel like it's gonna be a little more adventurous. Like, bad things happen for sure in this book. There's like a really terrible shipwreck and getting stranded in the South Pole, and there is peril. But for all that, it is a surprisingly slow-moving and, dare I say, boring kind of book. Like, I don't know. Like, there's some adventure. It just takes a really long time to get around to the actual adventure. It wasn't a win for me. All right, that is my review of the best and the not so best of our read-alouds from this year, and I'm excited to continue for many more years to come reading read-alouds to my kids. Let me know in the comments what were your most favorites and least favorite books, because I need to start building out my list for next year. I'll see you. Bye.